Well, it's about damn time for some conclusions here. Earlier in the year, I kind of teased you guys with the RockShox Super Deluxe Ultimate Air and the RockShox Super Deluxe Ultimate Coil here. And on the Transition Spire that I've been riding this season, it's been a pretty good bike. It's not been perfect, so I actually have something else I'm going to be experimenting with here shortly. But the Spire is you're not really gonna go wrong with it, I mean, it's a big burly bike. It's relatively light. It's a little bit flexier than some other things I've ridden in the past. But we'll go into this more in the future and what might be coming here as well in another video. But let's not interrupt that for too long and get back to the core of what we're gonna be talking about here, which is the air versus coil and which one's better and why and what do we think about each, and which way would I go if it is my personal bike, and things along those lines. So let's dive right into it. I'm going to change it so we can see here, and I'm going to talk about things in a little more detail. Interested to see. So like I said, I've been trying out the air and the coil version of the exact same shock, down to the way the dampeners are built. I think these dampers you could take off and put them on either one. They both have high speed, low speed, lockout, and low speed rebound on here. This on the coil shock is down here, just like most other coil shocks. The biggest difference is the coil shock also has hydraulic bottom out, which is normally relatively easily controlled by an air can and the spacers in here, so it's not necessarily required to have a hydraulic bottom out. But it's a nice little benefit that the coil shock does offer that, so you can actually control the bottom of the stroke and it doesn't feel like it's blowing through it as much. And while I actually couldn't feel it, which just probably means it's working really well. I'm also not the guy going off the biggest drops or anything like that, so it is a benefit, especially if you're going off bigger drops, you're a harder rider. But I am a heavy rider, so I end up going through a lot of travel just because of my size, and the dampers are working really hard. On the Spire, I'm actually able to keep relatively mid-range damping characteristics. Like I'm not having to go to either extreme on any of the dials or any of the positioning to get the work for me, which is nice. This is a standard factory tune. It's not a Transition Spire tune. It is something I seeked out. I guess I could have gotten one for the coil shock, but it was not going to be possible to get for this. And either way, it's worked out really well. The Transition Spire doesn't have any crazy suspension characteristics that really needs a special tune for. I'm sure if you got the special tune, it'd probably be a little better, but that's the baseline of where we're at. So let's compare them. Talk about what's good and bad about each one, and maybe hopefully I'll figure out which one's right for you. First off, I want to say both these shocks really are excellent. They both perform really well, and this is going to be a bit of a boring discussion because it's probably what you've heard from other videos. The air shock's a little more poppy, naturally has a little more progressivity and bottom out resistance due to it being air and the way air gets compressed into the spring. And the coil shock is definitely a little more small ability, and it feels a little more controlled overall. It doesn't feel as, I don't want to say wild, but it doesn't feel as poppy, but it's not like it feels like a slug either, so it's kind of hard to describe. This feels a little more damped and controlled overall while having a very similar damping characteristic on larger movements. It's on those really small little chattery sections where the coil shock really, really shows what it's made of. It's able to keep the tire under the ground a little bit better compared to the air shock, where the air shock definitely wants to be able to pop off things a little easier than a coil shock. So if you like a more poppy ride, air is probably gonna be more your thing. If you like to stay real planted on the ground, the coil shock's really your thing. But at the same time though, it's not like extremes of either side of that spectrum. This does actually have very good small bump compliance, and this does not completely mute the trail into oblivion, which I have had in some coil shocks in the past. They're just so ultra supple, but they also blow through the travel really fast too. So it's probably a damper thing as well, this being a little more set up for how I need it. But so ease of maintenance. So let's just talk about maintenance real quick between a coil shock and an air shock. There's definitely a difference here. A coil shock has a longer service interval. There is no air seals sliding over each other. So like an air shock, you have a major air seal here that we all see, but there's also another set of seals in here where the damper body runs and actually creates the air spring that you're using. So both these need to be serviced relatively regularly. I believe they say 50 hours for this and 200 for the damper, and I believe it's 200 for this one, the damper itself. So yes, the major deep service is the same, but this has an air can that requires more attention than a coil shock does. That being said, the coil shock literally weighs twice as much as this air shock does. So, that's also something to consider. I mean, we're not talking about, 100 grams here. We're talking about 400 grams, 500 grams. As you saw in my initial video, which I'll link up here, he goes over some more of the details of what these shocks are and the weights and a couple things like that. So there is a real weight difference. I'm not a weight weenie per se, although, if I could save a couple hundred grams here, a couple hundred grams there, even being a bigger guy, it does make the bike feel a little more lively and peppy, even if I'm not actually going that much faster. But a lively, peppy bike, to be honest, is more fun. There's no way around that. Especially if it doesn't come at the expense of being able to monster truck through things like with the Spire. I mean, it's definitely lighter than other bikes I've ridden, and it's actually really quite light for what it is. I think it's like 35 pounds this configuration with a 600-pound coil rear shock, coil spring on the rear shock, which is on the heavy side, and pretty, super weight weenie build stuff. It's this GX cranks, EXO drivetrain, because at the time it was really cheap. Garber, they're light, but they're also strong and durable, and they're cheaper than the SRAM stuff. And so, a light bike is peppier and lighter in general. So an air shock, on top of its damping characteristics, saves you a fair amount of money. And, that could be the difference between a bike that's more lively and less lively feeling. It's not gonna make you faster to the top of the hill, really. In fact, the coil shock could possibly be faster to the top of a hill, especially if it's a real kind of chundery, crappy climb, where you haven't really gone over, technical obstacles all the time. That coil shock, like I said, little small bump compliance, especially at lower speeds, is phenomenal. It just keeps that tire stuck right to the ground, where this is gonna give you a little more, snappy feedback in the pedals. So if you have to make a little more power moves, this might be better, on your trail type. But I want to go back to what I was saying earlier. It's really like splitting hairs. I mean, both of these shocks are great. I really don't know if I could pick one, for the bike. This is definitely, if I'm doing a lot more park, this would be great. If I was doing a lot more trail riding, this would be great. But I've been trail riding this as well, and it's been great. So I think so my conclusion is there really isn't a huge conclusion. It's really personal preference and your train type and what you like and what you feel. And I don't think you can go wrong either way. It's a great time to be in the cycling world. In fact, I'm gonna do another video here in the future where I think we're kind of reaching, the pinnacle of bikes. I mean, they'll always find some way to make things better, but I think we're kind of running out of like major advancements. I think we could see that of how things are getting and, what sort of things are coming out to the market these days. Let me know what you think about that in the comments below. I'm definitely gonna be making a video about this here in the near future. Something I've been pondering for a while, how I wanna approach it. Maybe your guys' suggestions in the comments will help me get that video going in a good direction that everyone wants to hear about, not just purely my opinions on it. But yeah, so the Spire particularly seems to be fairly shock agnostic, which probably makes this conversation a little bit harder. Or maybe it's just that shocks have gotten so good that it doesn't really matter which one you're running. Either way, you're gonna be happy. And I think it might be a little bit of both these days. I think shocks have gotten extraordinarily good to the point where it doesn't matter if you're running an air or coil. It might actually matter more of what the bike was designed for. This bike doesn't seem to care which one it has on it. So maybe this is because of the way the suspension curve is. And maybe that is the conclusion here, that you should be following what your bike should be running. If your bike, especially if the company says, don't run a coil shock, you probably don't want to run a coil shock. Maybe they didn't design enough progressivity into the curve, suspension curve to accommodate a coil shock. Maybe they say only run a coil shock. That might be because the bike is so progressive that running an air shock would be detrimental, because you may not be able to get the air can to be linear enough to accommodate an air shock. Especially also for those bikes, having a custom tune would be much more important than a bike like this, or maybe some other Santa Cruz bikes or anything along those lines. Yeah, I think we're in a golden era of suspension. The RockShox Super Deluxe, I will definitely put my seal of approval on, of feeling just phenomenal. I actually have an older version on my Tallboy, which I've been running for a while, the Super Deluxe Ultimate. The old one doesn't have the new damper. Honestly, the new damper definitely feels better than the old one. Even though it's a shorter travel bike, I can definitely tell the differences they've done in this are fairly remarkable. So if you're looking at a RockShox Super Deluxe, maybe make sure you get the newer model year 23 and newer. Definitely the refinement is kicked up a couple of notches in the way the suspension feel is. There's just a couple of little moments in that travel under higher speed stuff that this is way more composed feeling and transitioning between, compressing and rebounding than the older one does. Not saying the older one's bad, but if you had a choice between model year 23 and the previous ones, all the way 23. Even if it costs more, honestly, I would go for the new one. So that's kind of my thoughts on this setup. Like I said, definitely leave a comment below on what your thoughts are on air and coil shocks, particularly as it comes to how it relates to bikes that are designed for one or another, or bikes that seem to be relatively shock agnostic. I'd love to hear your opinion on your bike. Like say if you have a Yeti or other bike that I don't have experience with, and you've tried both, that'd be great to hear some feedback. If you want to hear more about my thoughts on how I think we're reaching max bike, I don't think it's just mountain bike. I think it's just across the board. Gravel, mountain bike, road, TT, all of the above. I think we're kind of really hitting a couple of limits, of technological limits that we may not be surpassable. And I'll go into why I think that is, and any thoughts or comments you have on that would be great. It really helps steer the conversation in a better direction, I think, for everyone. Yeah. If you like this sort of video, like and subscribe. I know I didn't cut in a lot of riding footage. I've been trying to ride as much as I can. It's been difficult to actually get riding footage while riding because I'm riding with a bunch of people who have different skill levels and not riding places I'm familiar with. I don't want to be filming places I'm not familiar with for a number of reasons. It's just one more thing my brain will be on versus trying to actually concentrate on the trail and getting down it safely. If you like this sort of content, like and subscribe. And till then, next time.